Okay, that's Arvo Pärt, and we welcome you to our session, "The Difference Creation Makes: Catholic Art and Creative Imagination," right through that kind of welcoming tones of music that the great Arvo Pärt has given us. And so, welcome one and all to our session. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center at Loyola. And I'm happy to be with this wonderful group of scholars here as we have our roundtable. And so I'd just like to give you a little bit of a background before I hand it over, very briefly. This group met at our Graduate Summer Institute in the Catholic Imagination at Loyola last summer. We tried to get it going in 2019 on the heels of the third biennial Catholic Imagination Conference, and COVID came and got us. So we finally got it together, but we had to be on Zoom last summer. It was a fantastic group, and I'll just give you a quick scroll that you can see all these wonderful people. We had Randy Boyagoda was one of our faculty, Liam Callanan was a faculty member, and Bridget Pasolka, who was here presenting in a later session. I can't recommend her enough, and myself. And then we had all of our seminarians, 12 of us, and we are going toward publication of all this great group in our Hank Center journal, Nexus, coming out in January. So what were we doing? We are doing something rather exciting. And so you can see before you in your program, the kind of description of our objectives here today. What difference does creation make for artists? How does the practice of writing, musical composition, or visual art change when an artist understands her work as participation in divine creation? That's our keystone. And so you'll see today 4 very different takes on how that is done, how it's done as a living tradition, a living engagement, and how it's done through a variety of artistic forms and disciplines, kind of prayerful orientations, theological commitments. That's our work today. So we invite you, because we want to go for a roundtable approach, we want to invite you to really think about how to enter into the conversation toward the end there. Each of our presenters will go for about 10 minutes max, and then we'll engage each other kind of briefly, and then we'll invite comments from the assembled crowd. With that, let me just give you a brief introduction of our panelists, our scholars, and all of whom were in graduate school when we first started this, but some have gone different directions since then, which is really, really cool. And I'll do it in order of presentation. We're going to lead with Bill Gonch. And Bill is the Cornerstone Fellow in English at the Catholic University of America. Here in his doctorate in English from University of Maryland, College Park, his scholarship focuses on the creative adaptation of religious experience in 20th century American fiction. Welcome, Bill. I'll also say hello to batting second will be Rachel Nozicka. And Rachel is a PhD candidate at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. Rachel studies 18th century British literature with a particular focus on the intersection of poetry, ethics, and religion. Welcome, Rachel. Good to see you. Our third presenter is a domer, so it's going to be Katie Broussard. And Katie is an artist. She's got 2 degrees from here at Notre Dame. And she's an artist and an award-winning illustrator of Soren Starts a School, Audacious Ignatius, The Examen Book, and I'm a Saint in the Making. You can see more of her work at katiebroussard.com. Maybe even during this presentation you might slip over there, who knows. And then finally, last but not least, is the great Nathan Bradford Williams. And Nathan's from the University of Toronto. He is a doctoral candidate in theological studies at U of T, where his research interests considers theological aesthetics as a site for ecumenical dialogue. A resident of Nashville, Nathan also serves as campus minister at Middle Tennessee State University. So with that, I'd like to welcome to our podium Bill Gonch. Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you. All right. Here we go. And here we go. Swing this around here. So I've got a little... There we go. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Really excited to be here. Thank you to all my fellow panelists for joining me. So I want to kick this conversation off by talking about a bit about some recent developments in Catholic fiction, Catholic literature, because I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of ferment in Catholicism and the arts right now. Some people have said that there's a new Catholic literary revival going on. Certainly, there are a bunch of talented young writers, some of whom, like Phil Klein, Christopher Beha, have broken through with Big Four publishers and major prizes. There's a bunch of other talented young writers who are working in publishing with independent presses. In the last 10 years, there have been some new Catholic fiction presses started that are doing really exciting work. I think it's fair to say that in the 10 years since Dana Gioia's piece, The Catholic Writer Today, which sort of looked around and asked where Catholic writers were, there was a much greater presence of Catholicism in literature. I also think it's fair to say that numbers don't mean a lot unless that Catholic presence does something, unless it brings a true Catholic voice into American letters and solves some of the problems, some of the aporias that the broader literary landscape has reached. So I want to talk about a little bit of literary history and what Catholicism might say to it. I think it's also fair to say that stepping back a little bit, looking at mainstream literature, the 20th century was the great era of the novel of consciousness. Writers like Henry James, Kafka, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, David Foster Wallace, a whole bunch of others, pushed the novel to new feats of representation of the mind, often to the exclusion of plot and action. This was the era in which a chasm opened up between quote-unquote literary writers who dwelt on consciousness, who sort of turned away from plot, and popular writers in genres like mystery and fantasy and romance that emphasized plot, but were seen as less prestigious and less intellectual. Now, when consciousness was at the heart of the literary imagination, religious poetry and fiction characteristically emphasized it as well. They emphasized religious experience that took place in characters' minds. Conversion characteristically deepened our ability to perceive spiritual reality. It was a change of vision, a change of experience. Willa Cather's Jean-Marie Latour from Death Comes for the Archbishop is probably a characteristic example. He understands the miracles. He sort of reinterprets the church's miracles into a transformation of our vision so that we can see God's love. Now, I think that emphasis on a fiction of consciousness and conversion as a change of vision is beautiful, profound, and often, and certainly can be, entirely orthodox. But it's caught in this preoccupation with consciousness. And I think if we look at the broader literary landscape, writers more recently have found that preoccupation to be played out. Later in the 20th century, there was a turn to try to incorporate some of these popular forms. There were great literary novels that were also detective novels, or were also fantasies. There's a greater interest in plot and action, even in novels that are primarily concerned with consciousness. There's also a turn to politics, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, as an attempt to make action matter. There's this desire to sort of reunite consciousness, experience on the one hand, and plot on the other. But there's also, I think, a sort of felt inability to make those two fit, and that, I think, is where Catholicism comes in. In Christopher Beha's 2020 novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, one of the characters, a gifted but listless young woman named Margot Doyle, is a classic overthinking artist. She's one of these modernist writers. She's back home on a leave of absence from her PhD in English. Once she wanted to be a poet, but for years she's been unable to write anything she trusts. She sort of wrote a poetry of consciousness, of increasing self-understanding, but found that she didn't have anything worth saying. That's where the novel starts. It's a big novel. It proceeds through a whole bunch of these self-destructive acts. By the end of them, Margot's father has ruined his health and the family finances through alcoholism, some other members of the family have contributed as well. And Margot arranges to move with her father into a small apartment and become his caregiver. And then, after an accident, accompanies him in the hospital during his last days. It's just after she comes to the hospital, she sits down next to her father, reaches out to him, and all she can say is, I'm here, over and over again. But when she's done with that, she begins to write again. And she finds that this act of loving her father has opened up the doors of her creativity. By making a sacrifice on behalf of another person, she's opened the gates of her creative energy. It's a very different place than many other writers, many earlier writers have found creative energy. She moves away from consciousness and towards action. And why is that? I think by moving in with her father, she's taken an action that means something. And it means something in the quite literal sense that when we see it, when we read the scene and imagine this action, we can perceive its meaning. It's an action that signifies. We observe a young woman turn away from a career and social life to perform this act of sacrificial love, and we can read the love, ultimately a divine love, that it expresses. And it's because that she takes that significant action that she now has something to write about. She's moved away from consciousness and towards action. And her action has become, and by doing that, she's made herself legible to others and also to herself. I think that's the most Catholic thing in this Catholic novel. The fact that creativity is not in consciousness, but in actions that signify. This idea that actions mean, that by performing good actions we become signs of God's love, is a strain in Catholic moral reflection that we as Catholics and that the world, the culture of which we're a part, needs to recover. It's this point, for instance, that leads the Church in Gaudium et Spes, and then later in the Catechism, to describe marriage as a sign. There's a long-standing point in theology, and also to describe sins against marriage as disfigurements that obscure its true meaning. I think that's an important point. That what's wrong with adultery or with cruelty or neglect within a marriage is not just that it has bad consequences or hurts people, but that it makes it harder for everyone around the married couple to read them as an image of God's love. A good action is always a sign, and a true sign. A sin is always, to some degree, a lie or gibberish. It's that principle of sacramental action that I think points us towards a recuperation of plot. Plot in the New Catholic novel is going to involve bringing characters to moments that are able to signify, to become kind of embodied windows, figures, figures in stained glass through which we can see the light of God streaming. And doing that is going to show the broader literary culture, show the intellectual culture, something that it needs. Remember, there's this groping towards a way of writing in which our actions will matter. I think that's true in literature, and it's also true more broadly in the culture. There are a lot of recent unhappy cultural and even political movements that seem, at least to me, to be searching desperately for meaning, but looking in some of the wrong places. It'll take a new generation of Christian writers of genius, I hope there are some of them in this room, to show them where they should look. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. I'm going to minimize, or we're going to put this in the pres mode here, so pardon me. So, yeah, great. It's Rachel Nozicka, everybody. Welcome to our podium, Rachel. Good to see you.
Okay. I just want to go ahead and read this poem for you, because maybe not everyone is familiar with it. I don't have a British accent, so I'm just going to use my regular one. Okay. The poem's called Adam Posed. Could our first father, at his toilsome plough, thorns in his path and labor on his brow, clothed only in a rude, unpolished skin, could he, a vain, fantastic nymph have seen, in all her airs, in all her antic graces, her various fashions and more various faces? How had it posed that skill, which late assigned just appellations to each several kind, a right idea of the sight to frame, to have guessed from what new element she came, to have hit the wavering form, or given this thing a name. So, the paper I'm giving today is about Anne Finch, metrical form, and thinking about order. So, in his general audience on January 13th, 1988, St. John Paul II described miracles as revelations of God's kingdom, saying, "This power from on high, namely God himself, is above the entire order. It directs this order and at the same time makes itself known through this order." Thus, miracles can be demonstrated through order as they uphold or conflict with it. So with St. John Paul II's word in mind, I would like to read this 1709 poem, Adam Posed, written by Anne Finch, who's an 18th century British poet, and just kind of parse the way that she thinks about order. The short, light-hearted poem, upon careful reading, asks a deeply existential question. What if we've misunderstood order, the way that we think about order? The poem was written during a period of adjustment for Finch and for England overall, and it questions what people have become and how they understand God after the upheaval of the Glorious Revolution. The poem takes readers all the way back to Adam and to his capacity to name creation. And Finch's reconsideration of Adam's naming points up two things. First, how far humans have fallen, and second, how much beauty hums below the surface of all creation, including humans and poems, just waiting to be seen. So to give some context, Anne Finch served as the maid of honor to Mary of Modena, who was a Catholic, and Finch served her in the years before the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Finch's husband, Heneage, was a gentleman of the bedchamber to Mary's husband, James, the Duke of York, and who would later become King James II. At this time, because of James' conversion to Catholicism, his inheritance of the throne of England was called into question, and the increasingly Anglican population of Britain was deeply suspicious of Catholicism, especially because their rivals, Spain and France, were strongly Catholic. So James and Mary would eventually come to hold the throne in 1685 despite this controversy, but their reign was short-lived. In 1688, they were ousted from the throne of England by William and Mary of Orange, and they fled into exile in France. So because of their support of James and Mary, Anne and Heneage Finch left London for the countryside, where their sympathies were more tolerated. During her time with Mary of Modena, Finch was deeply impacted by the eventual queen's emphasis on education, and education was very important for Finch, and she uses it to call into question many of the social vanities that she saw consuming London. So in Adam Posed, Finch asks people to consider the negative impact of their superficiality. The poem calls into question Adam's ability to name such nymphs, as Finch calls them. So the poet asks, could our first father at his toilsome plough, thorns in his path and labor on his brow, could he, a vain, fantastic nymph, have seen and have given this thing a name? So if Adam saw people as they are today, would he be able to name them? So in this poem, Finch seems to be setting up both women and the audience as subjects to be scrutinized. The essential name, or the name of the essence of women, has been obscured because of their focus on their superficial concerns. Finch even refuses to use the name woman in the poem, calling her a vain, fantastic nymph, in all her airs, in all her antic graces, her various fashions, and more various faces. So a nymph with all of these external concerns. The objectification via these names draws out questions about the woman's subjecthood because she's so involved in appearances she's forgotten her own substance. At the same time that the poem points this out, it also draws out questions about the subjecthood of the audience. Readers can understand the essential nature of the woman being described, and they can name her because her name is familiar to them. Yet their ability to name is nothing like the biblical Adam's naming through divine inspiration. Adam's naming was a naming for the essence of humanity, or a naming of the essence of humanity, and not just the repetition of that name. The poem's form mimics humanity's inability to ever fully grasp or speak the essential nature of a human being, just as people, except Adam before the beginning of the fall, or before the fall, cannot fully speak the divine word that names all of creation's essence. The poem, with only 11 lines, initially appears to be an inadequate sonnet, so it can't fully speak the sonnet form. Whereas sonnets have 14 lines and are written in 10-syllable couplets, Finch's poem only has 11 lines and includes one triplet. So the triple rhyme at the end drives home the question about whether Adam could name the vain women by first discussing proper understanding of the creature and then questioning whether what people had become is something altogether different from their original form. The lines point out that Adam had given just or appropriate names to creation, saying that what was needed to do this was a right idea of the sight to frame, to have guessed from what new element the woman came, to have hit the wavering form or given this thing a name. So the ever-shifting form of humans caught up in appearances renders it difficult to pin down their elemental form. The poem itself begins like a sonnet, but then ends with the triple rhyme and only 11 lines. Thus the form has changed as the poem continues, and we appear to be mistaken for thinking that it was a sonnet at the beginning. This mistake on our part, however, is of course not a mistake on Finch's part at all. Finch begins the poem with an image of the fall. Adam is sweating as he works, which biblically is a symptom God tells Adam and Eve they will have to experience because of their transgression. Finch then asks if Adam would have been able to name the people who have fallen prey to vanity. However, we've already been given an image of Adam as fallen. His capacity to name, whether an ability given to him or a way by which God spoke through him, came before the fall. Finch's question then seems to be whether Adam would have been able to name vain humanity as a fallen human. The answer, of course, is no, or at least not without a miracle. As we mentioned earlier, St. John Paul II suggests that miracles can be momentary revelations of God, different ways of seeing order. It's a bit of a stretch to say that Finch is offering a new vision of the divine order itself, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that her re-visioning of the audience, that is, her reorientation of our vision, imitates the re-seeing that is necessary in order to get out of a rut in our thinking, or perhaps to get out of a pernicious habit like vanity. Finch's poem calls out people for being vain and untrue to themselves, but it also calls out the vanity of readers for falling prey to thinking they knew what was going on in the form of the poem. By showing us our mistake, Finch forces a closer reading of the poem. The last 3 lines get longer and longer, stretching from 10 to 11 to 13 syllables, prolonging the question of Adam's ability to name and making us labor ourselves to confirm our initial thought that the poem was a sonnet. This modification of form microcosmically reflects Finch's concerns with socially prescribed forms and just the way that people were thinking about form itself. And thus Finch demonstrates that what we see and perceive is not all that we get. Rather, below, or perhaps within the imagery, there's a greater order orienting us toward a deeper, more profound recognition of our humanity. The form of the poem throws us back upon ourselves and asks us to rethink our preconceptions of what order looks like and to appreciate in a new light how alternate forms of human and poetic order can bring us to a greater appreciation of the divine order and the infinite ways it reveals itself in the world. In short, the miracle of Adam posed is that Finch demonstrates how God can be seen in everything, but we must focus on the essence and the order of something before we can begin to better appreciate such divinity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd like to welcome Katie now to the. Are you going to sit? You're going to stand. Great, Katie.
Good morning. My talk is called The Difference Creation Makes, Illustrating the Vatican Observatory, and I'm going to be sharing some of my illustrations with you as well. I'm not used to seeing them 10 feet tall. One of my greatest delights as a parent is that my kids want to read books about science with me. I've noticed something interesting about these books. Many of them begin with a history of science section that often casually mentions that we used to explain the universe with God and stories of creation. but we don't need to do that anymore because we have science to explain the universe. The books seem to imply that because our scientific understanding has evolved since Genesis, creation and the role of God in the universe are irrelevant, a perspective that is not unique to children's books. Rather than replacing creation with science, I think it is important to be able to integrate the two. Even as our understanding of science allows us to explain the universe without relying on supernatural forces, our understanding of creation remains vitally important. Today, I'd like to talk about why I think this integration matters, talk about the Vatican Observatory as a case study of what this integration looks like in practice, and reflect a bit on my own process of creation as a painter, what it's been like to enter into these questions through art. I'd like to argue that in one sense, the statements of these science books are correct, that we do not need creation to explain the how of the universe. Creation does, however, give us a beautiful understanding of the why of the universe. And if we choose, it can enrich our understanding of science for two reasons. The first is that acknowledging ourselves as created beings allows us to marvel at how God created the universe to be knowable and orderly, but with an element of uncertainty and mystery. We have learned an incredible amount about the universe, even in the last 200 years. And even as each new discovery brings us closer to the truth, it also points us towards new questions and a deeper awareness of just how much we don't understand. The second is that understanding ourselves as part of God's creation puts us in a position of awe before the Creator for the incredible generosity of creation. The reaching of the trees for the sky, the infinity of the horizon, the constancy of the tides. Creation allows us to see the love of God and helps us to think about the purpose of science and technology and our responsibility to care for the earth and its creatures. The Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical research institutes in the world, provides a fascinating case study of how this type of integration can be achieved. Located in Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer home, the observatory is home to world-class astrophysicists, most of them priests and brothers, one of the largest collections of meteorites in the world, and 4 impressive telescopes. Brother Guy Consolmagno, S.J., Jesuit astrophysicist and director of the observatory, describes its almost comically paradoxical history in this way. Castel Gandolfo was built on land once part of the imperial palace of the Emperor Domitian, the first emperor to systematically persecute Christians. His palace is now the Pope's summer gardens and home. The papal palace itself was built around 1590 by Pope Urban XIII, the pope behind the trial of Galileo. His palace is now an astronomical observatory. The building itself was incorporated into papal territory by Pope Clement XIX, who in the 1700s caused the Jesuits to be suppressed for nearly 50 years. Since the mid-1930s, one wing has served as a community for Jesuits, working at the Vatican Observatory. End quote. Among the many research activities taking place at the Vatican Observatory, it is notably home to an enormous collection of meteorites, pieces of asteroids from outer space that have landed on Earth, also called shooting stars. Meteorites are a bit like fossils. Their densities and chemical compositions give us a snapshot of what was happening in the universe at the time they were formed, and they are also really beautiful. Iron meteorites, formed from the core of an asteroid, have a crystalline pattern inside. Stony iron meteorites contain olivine crystals, and stony meteorites from the mantle of an asteroid honestly look pretty boring, with the exception of eucrites from the asteroid Vesta, which, when observed under polarized light, look like stained glass. Brother Guy writes that the mark of the Creator is beauty. The stars do not have to be beautiful, but they are. and the equations that explain them do not need to be elegant, but they are. Our understanding of creation is not a threat to our understanding of science. Rather, it has the ability to enrich our experience of learning about science. Brother Guy writes, quote, "You can do good science, whether or not you think the world is good, and you can come up with the Big Bang Theory, whether or not you think that God is love. But the goodness of the world and the love of God are where Christians locate the answer to the question, why can we ask why?" In closing, I'd like to reflect a bit on my own creative process. I'm an artist and a children's book illustrator, and as my research into this topic has unfolded, it's become clear to me that these illustrations are a work in progress of a picture book about the Vatican Observatory, which I think is a great way to tell the story of the work that has been done there through the centuries and continues today. In many ways, working on this project has come very naturally to me. I love to paint night scenes, and I have always been interested in painting the juxtaposition of organic and inorganic elements. The human geometry of the buildings and gardens of the Vatican Observatory, under the abstract mass of stars in the sky, our creation and God's creation, bumping up against each other, in conversation with one another. In other ways, this has been completely different from my previous work. This is the first time I have explored science in my art, ventured into space, or tried to illustrate things that are invisible. I have tried to portray the vastness of space and time, the vastness of scales between the infinitely huge and the infinitely tiny, as shown in this illustration here. These are images of light from the stars, called stellar spectra, that are created by electrons jumping tiny fractions of nanometers. And the patterns they create can tell us the temperature of a star in tens of thousands of degrees, and the star's distance from Earth in billions and billions of kilometers. Today, these diagrams are made digitally, but one of the pioneers of using spectra to classify stars was Father Angelo Secchi, Vatican Observatory director in the 1800s, and he made his spectra by hand. And I think they're really beautiful that way, as well as useful, so I painted mine by hand as well. In creativity, as in science, each step of curiosity about the universe brings us one step closer to the truth. Brother Guy writes that, quote, "God reveals himself in the things he has made. Of all the ways God could have made the universe, the fact that he chose to make it this way instead of that way tells us something about his personality. The physics behind how a star shines is not only logical and reasonable, but it's also beautiful. And so is the star itself. The joy we experience from that beauty is why the universe is such a delight for us. God calls us to create as well, and observing the universe as God's creation changes the way I look at the universe as an artist. Creating these paintings has been a delightful process of learning about the universe as a lens into the personality of the creator." Thank you.
Thank you, Katie Broussard, very much. Beautifully done, all three so far. Our fourth will promise us to be the same with our friend Nathan Bradford Williams. Nathan, are you going to go from down there, or you want to go to the podium? Okay.
I think I just use the... I do want to cue something up real quick. Sorry, apologies.
No worries. Again, as Nathan is getting set up, let's think about maybe ways to engage. So write your question down, have it ready to go, and we'll have some great integration when the time comes. Thank you.
Gosh, I'm sorry, but I'm not good at this stuff.
No problem.
Okay. Thanks very much. Oh, okay. What am I doing? Worst nightmare. Presenter. I'm folding between everyone. In front of everyone. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. My topic today is logogenesis in the music of Arvo Pärt, the Estonian composer. Briefly, just to start off with that question, what is this term? What is logogenic music? Alfred Einstein distinguished between pathogenic, logogenic, and melogenic music. Pathogenic, he said, was a pure expression of music, in music of a feeling, unmediated by words. Melogenic was music according to a melody first, in which words would be fitted metrically. And finally, logogenic is music generated by the text, a pride of place given to the words themselves. So in the beginning were the words, and only the words, talking in Western music, let's say. Perhaps some diacritical markings would be written above words to indicate their shape, but these were mostly mnemonic. Here is a story of Western music after 800 in way too broad of strokes. Musical notation in the modern sense is owed to Guido d'Arezzo only from the 11th century on. After this, we have a development in the plain song idiom, proliferation of these liturgical parts, articulation of different voices, principal and organ, and then of kind of a medieval polyphony. After this, an early humanism, and with that, a revival of classical rhetoric, see especially Josquin de Prix, music as itself conveying meaning, word painting coming to the fore, how to illustrate particular words in a musical form, and that kind of leading to a excess in what would be called madrigalisms. If we fast forward several centuries to the tin era of Immanuel Kant, he heard music as frivolous, and he memorialized this famously in his Aesthetics, perhaps the most famous work, important work in aesthetics, drawing up impassioned oppositions. We had from here a kind of an idea of program music, music free from a sung text, but meant nevertheless to evoke a feeling or a story. After this, kind of an absolute music, the idea of aspirationally music free of any reference to meaning outside of the music itself. And kind of on a line with that, a modern atonal method of Schoenberg, amongst others, supposedly free even of a hierarchy amongst musical tones themselves. I suggest that music here is facing a crisis of normativity in its confrontation with meaning, to crib a term from Jeremy Wilkins. So between the poles of scientism and historicism, the twin temptations to grasping nostalgia or paralysis pinned down by the weight of history. Wilkins says, however, the way forward, nevertheless, is to acknowledge relativity without becoming relativistic, to be historically honest without becoming historicist, to find a cultural norm above every cultural form so that we may face contingencies squarely without succumbing to arbitrary decisionism. I'm submitting to you today that Arvo Pärt does exactly this in the musical crisis of normativity. First, to meet Arvo Pärt. He was born in 1935 in what was then independent Estonia, which was soon to face occupation from Germany and then annexation to the Soviet Union. After finishing conservatory, Pärt was a rising star in Estonia's musical elite, the first of his countrymen to work in the 12-tone serial and collage techniques, very much in that atonal mode. Throughout the 60s, however, Pärt became more and more restless with the groundlessness and superficiality he was finding in the high culture of his profession. As his wife Nora described it, each composer created his own personal language without there being any possibility of translation, a crisis that Arvo felt to crush everything that was living that arose within him. After 1968's Credo, an overtly religious cri de coeur, and a sardonic acceptance speech at the Composers Union, adorned in a long-haired wig, Pärt withdrew into a musical retreat that would last 8 years. He described this as a seeking after something in music that was alive and simple and not destructive. Although tempting to conflate this with his own conversion to Orthodox Christianity, Pärt credits as a guide to his search a chance encounter with Gregorian chant. He was fascinated with that unity of word and music that he perceived and agonizingly attempted to replicate that very essence of music. Far from inactive, these years were spent further in studying tonality, melody, and then harmony and polyphony. What resulted was a so-called discovery of a relationship between notes, what Pärt would come to call his tintinnabuli method. Today regarded as his defining achievement, tintinnabuli tintinnabuli accounts for the sonic signature of Perrot's music. Perrot has commented on his music that the two voices, separate though they sound, are in reality of one essence, expressed with the paradoxical phrase 1 + 1 = 1. Sometimes he puts it simply that the melodic voice represents my sins and imperfections, while the second voice is the forgiveness afforded to me. In addition to the tonal rules that Perrot has followed since 1976, another element marks the vast majority of his work since then, namely the prominence given to texts in his works. Of these, all but a few use Christian sacred texts, scriptural, liturgical, and saintly. For Perrot, the text here generates the music. He does not simply set a text. His approach is best seen in Passio of 1982. The work is a presentation of the passion narrative of the Gospel of John, sung in the Vulgate's Latin and lasting just over an hour. Throughout the work, Perrot adheres strictly to rules to determine the tonal and rhythmic content. The roles are each assigned a particular tonal range unique to that character, and the music operates according to a tintinnabuli procedure. Each role is assigned a particular tempo range as well, with 3 note lengths each, short, medium, and long. With these unique ranges and tempos, each of the roles has an aural character discernible to the ear of the listener, even before any comprehension of the text itself. As for the rhythm, Perrot eschews any discernible time signature or beat and gives 1 bar per word. As in the rules found in medieval treatises, Perrot is guided by the punctuation of a sentence. If the segment has a colon or period, it will use long notes, medium if there is a comma or question mark, and short for all others. Here's a brief example of this using from John 18, 4-5. You'll hear the evangelist singing as the choir together, and you notice the lengths of notes that they use. And then Jesus' response, sung by the bass voice with the quem quaeritis. Let's see if this is going. Well, here's a flavor of the voice of Christ in Passio, sung by the bass in the longest of the notes that are possible in this. So an idea of the aural character generated by each of the rules that are given by Perrot that are based off the text themselves, strictly on the punctuation. Okay. What does this mean for a religious work such as a biblical passion narrative to be presented in a formulaic, let's say, way? Does it rob the listener of the emotional investment they may have come to expect in such large-scale works of religious music? Or does the lack of word painting, as typically understood, allow the text itself to be presented and the emotional and other meaning content to come through? Of course, I would say Perrot's Passio is an interpretation of the text of St. John, but it is one that, like ancient plain chant traditions, tries to draw attention away from the composer's authorial intent and toward the interpretation that the text itself offers on itself. For what is punctuation in a sentence, besides an indicator to the reader of how to read, how to interpret a text? Interestingly, logogenic music is not limited to pieces that are sung in Perrot's repertoire. For a significant number of his instrumental works, Perrot has used sacred text as generative for the rhythmic and syntactic composition of a work. That is, in a similar manner to the mechanism we see in Passio, Perrot reads a text and allows its syllabic, grammatical, and punctuational data to shape the music that he writes. For example, Silouan's song, which was sometimes is even printed with the words underneath the cello part, as in the same way it would be in a choral score. Does Perrot's way of using text let it come through to the listener? Perhaps in another way, is there, say, a charismatic mission being accomplished here by setting these sacred texts? Such questions may be beside the point. Perrot has been explicit on the one hand, both about his Orthodox Christian faith, and on the other, that the aim of his music is not evangelistic, that he will not impose a single interpretation of his music upon the listener. Instead, It is perhaps illustrative to remember Pert's self-schooling in the process of retrieval. In the combination of his recently deepened religious faith and his quest to find the roots of melody, Pert fell into a practice in which he attempted to be a human creative conduit for the words of prayer that he engaged. He describes reading a psalm and immediately trying to set it to a single line of melody. He filled thousands of pages of notebooks with these sketches, the vast majority of which were never to see another form in his corpus. Example up here. These were spiritual as much as musical exercises, a training in a kind of prayer that attuned Pert to the shape and operation of the words pregnant with the word. Thus, Pert's music, engaged with sacred text, is as much an artifact of prayer as it is an artifact of art music. Perhaps his music could be likened to the written form of Alexio Divina, or simply an icon in sound, strictly adhering to a form, but the whole time prayed into creation. One final thing should be said to tie my piece back to the theme of this roundtable and this conference as a whole. The difference creation makes, and it was very good, cannot be thought without reference to the maker of creation and the one who called it very good. Genesis 1 for the Christian cannot be thought without reference to John 1, that God who spoke creation into being was also the word that was sent forth, born into the world for its salvation, and the sanctification, the participation of this creation with the work of the Creator. The Christian artist participates in work of the Creator by analogy endowed with the ability to create. With attention to the word in the words, Arvo Pärt shows an example of the human cooperation with God in creation through the word. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Thanks, panel. Excellent job. And we're right in good shape to have a conversation. So I'm going to ask the panel to begin. It's not exactly a round table, but we're going to, the room has a roundness to it somehow. So I'm going to ask the panelists, first of all, to speak into the microphone for the camera and for everybody else. But what did you hear in each other that you want to pick up on that may have rhymed with your own themes, your own interests? What's moving in you? What ideas are alive in you?
Well, I'll get started with a couple of things. First, I've got a question for the audience. I wonder if we can make this a bit more of a round table. We really want this to be a conversation. Would folks like to move a little closer? Or if we can get up and kind of bring things together. We're going to bring you into the conversation. I really want to hear what you have to say, what questions you have. And I think it'd be really nice if we sort of got all a little bit closer together. So come on up. All right, and while we're doing that, I guess I'll turn to my fellow panelists. Here we go. I won't turn away from the microphone. There we go. And ask if you guys could speak a little bit about the implications of what you said for further work in your disciplines. Maybe I'll start with Katie. You sort of gave us this really wonderful talk on Brother Guy and on sort of these illustrations. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your process or what difference creation makes, maybe even less about your process and about the art itself. What difference does creation make for the way that you choose to represent asteroids and sort of features from outer space?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I think that just an awareness of those concepts as creation is a bit transformative, just to think, just the awe that evokes, and just the awareness of the Creator's generosity. It was, part of my process is just kind of like reading and digesting the information. There's just a lot of like background information that I had to read to be able to understand the stellar spectra and whatnot. I did teach high school physics for 11 years, so that helped a little bit. But there was a moment in my research in each case where like it sort of like engaged my scientific imagination and religious imagination, and I could sort of see how it would come together in an illustration and something that I wanted to communicate to the viewer. And it made me think a bit about what you all said. Nathan, you called it iconography in your work, but I think we all sort of referred a bit to like something that an artist creates as a sign of, or an image of the creator in some way.
Thank you, Katie. Let's be sure. Let's maybe take that mic out and pass it.
Sure.
Yeah, just so the camera can pick this up and everything else. Yeah, or just pass it over. And there you go. What do you think, Rachel?
So I, in discussing kind of where I want to go from here, I'm really interested in, as kind of my bio said, I'm interested in the connections between religion and poetry. And Anne Finch is really interesting because she writes specifically, for as long as I'm here, this is a paraphrase, for as long as I'm here, religion is my business and poetry my play. But she uses poetry to talk about religion a lot, and so exploring kind of the play, like the creative imagination that's being employed in these discussions of religion, because she's looking at the Bible and translating it in some sense into poetry, and so there's a really interesting kind of dialogue happening there. And also friendship, which I know is important to the De Nicola Center. Finch was very fascinated with just the way that friendship works. And in many ways, she felt very lonely after they moved away from London. She was alone, kind of out in the countryside, and she enjoyed it because she could follow her creative pursuits, but at the same time, she didn't have the same connections that she did in London. And then when she would go back to London, she would see her friends sort of caught up in just a lot of very, I keep using the word superficial, but all of these very superficial things, and she would be kind of frustrated with that. And sometimes poetry was the way that she could point those things out and kind of lovingly criticize her friends in the hopes to kind of change them. So those are my next steps, I think.
Picking up maybe on what Bill asked or I asked, how do you view your work? You're in dissertation mode. So how do you, I can tease something out, like if I'm thinking maybe, Nathan, between Rachel and you, and maybe Balthazar, seeing the form, something's very important in formalism of Anne Finch. The incomplete sonnet is an incomplete view the reader might have, the vanity of the reader to see what's there. Arvo Pärt, punctuation is very important. So there's something grammatical about all this. Does that maybe help pick things up, or what's moving in your mind?
Yeah, no, I think that punctuation part, and that's like something he follows in Passio and in some other pieces. It's not uniform in every single work that he does. There's actually quite a variety of how this stuff gets applied. But I think the point to draw to what Katie was mentioning, that I briefly mentioned about icon, that's a highly formal pursuit. Like writing an icon, there's rules and it's everything has been codified and how to do that, but it's always meant to be prayed as well. So which is an interesting thing to say about form and spirit in some way, to go those two things together. I'm also struck by one of the things that I keep returning to Arvo Pärt's music. It has a spirit to it that I see, like I'm talking about this kind of retrieval, that there's something that I'm trying to articulate he's picking up on in the logogenic kind of thing that makes it sound akin, somehow it echoes to an ancient kind of chant tradition or something there. But it's very modern music. It's not, no one would mistake it for something medieval. And I think that has to do with all the stuff he's grasped and learned from his modern period and all those things too, those techniques, but somehow getting back to some sort of essence and applying that to it. So all the form, all the poetic, I don't know, it ties to a number of things that we were talking about how is there, even to Bill, like about a kind of a renaissance or newness in literary art, but somehow we always have the weight of history and all the things behind us too. But how do we, or any kind of form or whatever preexists those things. So yeah.
Let me add before I pass to Bill. We've been talking for a while. We met again last night, but we've been having a conversation which is important to the whole process. This is just not a panel where we come and spray and then leave. But I would say one thing about icons. Arvo Pärt writes music while sitting at his piano in front of an icon of our Blessed Mother and the Christ Child. That's where he gets his inspiration. Do you have any thoughts, Bill, on any of this?
Yeah. So what Nathan was saying, what you were saying, Nathan, about the rootedness of Pärt's work in the words, sort of if I'm understanding this right, that you traced an evolution of Western music away from the underlying text, and it seemed as though Pärt is trying to, I'm gonna use my terms, and you can tell me if they actually apply. But trying to overcome a felt exhaustion or sterility in where a purely formalist music had gone. There's so far that you can go in breaking free from tonality and in breaking free from established musical form and breaking free from language. And maybe Schoenberg is that limit, or maybe some post-Schoenbergians. Eventually you get to the point where a piece of music is just 4.5 minutes of silence. You can't actually go further than that. And so it seems like Pärt is working at this moment when we'd reached the end of something, but people weren't sure what to do next. Mm-hmm. And his work seems to be an attempt to return to the underlying language without simply repeating what had been done in the tradition so far, which is why he's not returning to meter. He's not returning to. It sounds like he's not really working in a scale in the traditional sense. But is that fair? Maybe I'm wrong. But he's nevertheless returning to the underlying text. Is that? And if that's true, then he's doing something very similar to what I think recent fiction has been trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's. Sorry, I don't want to dominate this, but that was. Yeah, I would say maybe not. I don't want to throw Western music since 800 under the bus. Like that's not what I'm trying to do. I think wouldn't say it's. I think everyone would say there's attention whenever you're setting a text. Any composer would say that there's attention to the text, but it becomes about. Often it's been about an interpretation. The classic examples of text painting are like. In the Credo, where Christ descended into hell, you have a downward going in the tone, right? Okay, that seems to like, but that's not at the level of the word. There's an interpretive, there's a hermeneutical thing already on there to about what that should be. So different understandings of meaning with that. Yeah, I think that there's like a history of music and discourse about music has always been. Or not always, but often, for much of the bulk of it, has been caught up with questions of music and language and music and meaning. And then the different battle lines just from modernity that get drawn up that kind of about freeing from that idea of meaning or freeing from that idea of the word led to kind of this, as I'm narrating it, trying to narrate it, and as Pärt says, like that crisis that he felt of being unmoored from everything and trying to return back. So yeah.
I'm going to work out to the audience here, but Rachel or Katie, conventions in Augustan poetics versus late modern, or in design values in medieval Renaissance current. But as they're maybe thinking, I think if you have a question at all, great. I'll go back over here. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I'm thinking about the sonnet form, I guess. So Finch is coming off the heels of Milton, who wrote the famous blank verse epic, and the sonnet form was something that we'd started with in Shakespeare and then moved up, and we were more in the epic, and then Finch is kind of reintroducing the sonnet because at this time people are writing a lot of essay poems, and so kind of tinkering with this older form and giving like an incomplete sonnet, or maybe we give it a different name. She's helping us sort of rethink the way that we talk about structure and the way that ideas can fit into a structure. And I think that kind of all of us have been talking about the way that we use structure to kind of like let a thought come up from it, and the way that we use structure to rethink the connections between science and art and literature. So.
Thanks. It was a great panel. Thank you all. I'm just wondering about, from each of you, if you could speak to like explicitness. So for the Christian artist, what sort of, how do you negotiate the fact that maybe the more explicit you get with Christian content, maybe the less resonance the culture feels with the material? So in a sense, you have to kind of use the grammar or hide some things in order to reveal some other things that the reader or the listener has to kind of find on their own, because there seems to be, I'm thinking of some of these like cloying Christian films that just beat you over the head. And when we see this painting and this poetry and the scene in the hospital, it is sort of it feels like a moment to reach out to prayer without it sort of like, coaxing me or being compulsive. So wondering how in each of this kind of mixed media panel, explicitness of Christianity kind of plays into either your creative process or your reading of art.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's a question that every Christian writer or anyone working in a representational form needs to deal with. It kind of reminds me of Stendhal's line about politics in a novel, which is, he compares politics, I'm not going to get the line exactly right, but he compares politics in a novel like a gunshot in a theater. It's entirely vulgar compared to what's going on, but it still demands your attention. And there is something, so there's a way in which a lot of sort of direct preachiness in a novel doesn't work. I think the direct preachiness in novels tends to fail in the same way that direct political preachiness or other sort of messages direct messages all get kind of taken up within the novel in the same way as feeling like, in some sense, an artistic failure. Some really interesting Christian writers disarm that and kind of try to have it both ways. So Beha, in the novel I talked about, gives us another character who gets deeply invested in this street preacher, New York street preacher, has the guy move into his house. There's a sort of running question and so he has these really intense, powerful, moving religious conversations. And so the character in question has recently come back from military service and has, in one particular case, done something that he sinned, and he has not been able to get by it. And this street preacher, in a really moving moment, gives him a kind of forgiveness that he can't get from any psychiatrist, because he also holds the character responsible. There is this acknowledgement, yes, you have sinned, and now I can forgive you. But the whole thing is run through this ongoing question, is this guy a fraud? And the answer turns out to be yes. The guy actually essentially steals all of the character's money and runs off with it. But the forgiveness was still real. And there's this way in which the scene and the power of both acknowledging his sin and then speaking God's forgiveness is still there. The fact that the guy was a fraud, I think for a lot of readers disarms us from our immediate kind of skepticism of bringing in a religious character. But nevertheless, even the fraud is able to participate in this particular moment in God's forgiveness of the character. So the moment, in some ways, it's a lot like the principle that the sins of a priest do not invalidate the sacrament confected by the priest. That this moment is real, it's a channel for forgiveness through this character who is not being used as a moral exemplar. That's one example. I could go to some other examples in fiction, but I'm instead going to go do some other examples from my fellow panelists if they want to say something. Katie?
A lot of what I create is for children, but I think what I would like to share also, I think, applies to work for adults. I have been reading lately the work of Sophia Cavalletti, who writes about the religious potential of the child. And
Catechesis of the Good Shepherd.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. And so she says in presenting religious ideas to children, we have to be very careful to remember that they already have a relationship with God and a very deep understanding of God, maybe deeper than ours. And just to be respectful of that relationship when we deliver information to them. And so when I illustrate children's books, I cringed at the word that you used, cloying. I'm always trying to not be cloying. I think that's a good description. But I think that if I am able to respect that relationship that the child has, in a illustration, and sort of speak to that pre-existing relationship rather than thinking of I'm delivering some information that they've never experienced before. That's kind of helpful for me.
That's great.
It sounded like each of you were talking about reestablishing order in different types of senses, and I think my question builds on the previous one in terms of in the cultural climate that tends to celebrate disorder and normalize disorder. You're talking about even looking at marriage, and we celebrate the fragmentation of marriage and the family life today. What hope do we have in terms of sparking curiosity in establishing new order in light of that cultural climate, in terms of it's going to gain the attention and curiosity outside of Catholic circles?
It always takes a minute to hit. We know that. You've given us something to think about here. So, yeah, what do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that I think you're right about order. I might dispute a little bit the issue of marriage. When I read, so I think you're right that there is the culture celebrates the fragmentation of marriage, and there has been a run of recent articles in the last few years in major magazines. There was one at The Atlantic of people sort of accounting for, in a celebratory fashion, their decision to leave their marriage. But those articles always read kind of brittle to me. And I have a hunch that it always seems like there's a kind of sadness there, sort of underneath the celebration of marriage seems performative. It seems to me like the problem is less that we're celebrating the fragmentation of marriage, and more that we don't really believe deep down that a loving, faithful, permanent marriage is possible. It seems like underneath a lot of these articles is a wish that it could have been different. But we sort of celebrate the supposed acknowledgement that, well, it wasn't different.
We got about 2 minutes, so that's interesting. That really...
You really have only 2 minutes?
I know.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So I guess to the point of order, I think what I heard in Rachel's talk was that, so the order that Finch is uncomfortable with is, I mean, it's kind of a depiction of marginalization, this character who had been so closely affiliated with the Jameses that they were then sort of shoved aside by the new order. But the order she's looking for is something more like harmony, and that's the play of the poem, that real order isn't this thing imposed by the new state of William and Mary. It's actually more like a kind of mutual shared play.
Even the word hierarchy is always much embattled, but it simply means sacred arrangement, which bespeaks a harmony. Any final words from the panel on anything? One more point you want to make?
To the question of kind of both to explicitness and to outside of, let's say, Catholic circles or things with that. I think with Parrott is interesting because he works in music, and a lot of his stuff is instrumental. So the explicitness is less. I mean, a title, will take a listener a certain way, but I think, and I didn't get into this here so much, but the tintinnabuli kind of thing to it. He speaks very poetically a lot of times about that, of these two voices, and the melody voice wandering all over the place. It's kind of it's freely composed. It goes to where it is, and then the second voice, the triadic voice, is always tonally related to it, that it harmonizes with it, and it follows along that melody voice wherever it goes. And there's explicit Christian kind of ideas with that too, right? And that in reality, these two things are coming from the same source, there's same essence to that. But I think it's something that gets picked up on listeners to his music. There's a great phenomenon of many non-religious people who find deep spiritual resonance in this music. And Parrott is always explicit about his own Christianity and things like that. So I think it stands this kind of, in some ways, as a example of it's speaking to the heart. It's speaking to a human experience of wandering, but that need or want for that comfort and forgiveness, the solace that's there. So, yeah.
10 seconds for you guys. I know it's pressure. Sorry. Maybe I'll just an observation. Rachel last night was speaking about, because what's next with AI questions, and Rachel said AI makes things perfect, and with Parrott it's like voice one makes the mistake, voice two is mercy, and there's something about that I think that stuck with me. Maybe it sticks with the idea of the human creature, or as a sub creator in the image and likeness of God. So something like that for me. But we'll table and we'll pick it up after the talk. But for now, please join me in thanking our panel for a very good job.